Alrighty, time for another episode of Shattered Legacies Deep Dive. In today's episode, we are going to be going over another one of the major factions. However, before I actually start that, I need to say something. It's not about the channel or anything, so don't freak out. Within Shattered Legacies, there are many threats ranging from minor threats such as the less powerful primary factions such as the Bastilians, the Avetans, and the Florians. And then you have more major threats in the form of the Barramon, the humans, and the absolute monster that is the Cibertan Empire. You have galaxy and sometimes even universe-spanning wars that leave nothing but scorched earth and ash in its wake. Entire planets and solar systems annihilated within a single battle simply out of necessity. However, despite all of this, despite all of the technology that each faction has achieved, there is one threat that reigns supreme above all others. A threat that even when each faction was at their pinnacle, had they bound together as one unified force, still wouldn't be able to deal with this threat. This threat has a simple name, yet the consequences of allowing it to run free are beyond imagination. It is known as the Blight Plague. Now, what is the Blight Plague? Well, its name is kind of pseudo-correct. Blight is a disease that infects plants and more specifically crops, and it can quite literally ruin a harvest. It is incredibly damaging to a farmer even, or even just a small-time gardener. And you should be well aware of what a plague is. However, this isn't a plague of blight. No, if only Blight Plague were quite so innocent. Blight Plague, in its simplest, most basic form, is a sickly, yellowish, pale sludge that is on the ground. It expands ever so agonizingly slowly, consuming any plants that are in the area, converting them into biomass, which from henceforth we'll simply just call this sludge biomass or Blight Plague biomass. If left alone, it doesn't pose that much of a threat. The threat comes when a sapient creature, some creature that is capable of autonomous movement, comes into direct physical contact. Blight Plague, the Cibertan Empire, which typically leads the forefront of scientific understanding, even when compared to Florians, aren't really sure what Blight Plague is. It's not a bacteria, it's not a fungus, it's not a virus. It's not any of the normal understandings of what a disease is. Its best could probably be described as a cancer on reality itself. And nobody's entirely sure where it comes from. After all, new Blight Plague instances aren't simply seeded by another instance of Blight Plague on a planet and allows it to grow. The best anybody can describe is you could be looking out on a serene view, whether this be in a city or out in nature somewhere, and it's pristine, and then you blink your eyes, or sometimes it even happens right in front of you without you having to blink. There's all of a sudden this, again, sickly, yellowish, pale sludge pool that's just on the ground. And your natural inclination is, was that there before? I should go and investigate it. Which is probably one of the biggest mistakes that you can make. Now, to be fair, even just leaving alone is dangerous as an animal may come across it. When Blight Plague comes into contact with a living creature rather than just plant material, it has a startlingly different reaction. it spreads through the organism like literal wildfire, something the size of a human or Siritan being from non-infected to fully irreversibly infected in less than 2 seconds. The virus well, I guess it's not a virus, but the disease, the substance, Blight Plague, shooting through your body, ripping apart your body at the atomic level, seam by torturous seam, and rebuilding your body into a Blight Plague form. At this point, the creature that has been infected is known as a plagueling. Now, plaguelings aren't particularly dangerous. They are slow. They don't have any higher mental capabilities. Their sole objective is simply to move forward and to infect. Kind of like a zombie, honestly. They aren't particularly physically strong. They're not agile. They're relatively durable to almost every single form of damage, however. Now, to really get an idea of what Blight Plague looks like, let's talk about 2 different fantasy factions. And I actually have to make sure that one of these actually exists, because I'm pretty sure it does. Give me 1 second. Yes, it does. Okay. So, Blight Plague looks like a combination of the Halo universe's Flood mixed with the Gears of War universe's Lambent, otherwise known as the Glowies. It's, again, I've said this twice now, a sickly, yellowish, pale creature that is covered in blisters and boils and scars and growths, pus sacs and tentacles and spikes and claws, and just malformed to high hell. Infection is simple. Physical contact is all it requires. It doesn't require it to bite you. It doesn't require it to scratch you. Hell, it doesn't even require it to damage your body in any way, shape, or form. Simply coming into physical contact with your skin on anything that is Blight Plague is a death sentence, instantly infecting you. And you can see how something like this could spread like wildfire in a matter of hours, which oftentimes is how long it takes to deal some insane amounts of damage. So, Blight Plague is notoriously difficult to deal with, simply because it's resilient to almost every single damage type. It is resistant to kinetic weapons such as bullets. It is resistant to energy weapons. It is resistant to chemicals and corrosion. It is resistant to explosions. The only thing that really seems to properly deal with this stuff is either atomizing it with a nuclear bomb or setting it on fire. However, even setting it on fire has suboptimal effect. It's more efficient than using any other form of damage other than, again, a nuclear bomb, but there's consequences to using something like that. So, when an instance is first discovered, the best possible thing that you can do is report it and burn the sludge away before it comes into contact with any animal. And the interesting thing about Blight Plague is that it has a hive mentality, similar to, I always draw comparisons to it because Shattered Legacies was somewhat heavily inspired by Warhammer 40k. They have a hive mind similar to the Tyranids, and it is a single consciousness. Now, this isn't all the Blight Plague. This is specifically that instance of Blight Plague that spawned on that world, has its own unique hive mind, and it can communicate with other hive minds. However, it has to first reach a specific level of growth. So how does it achieve growth? Well, the hive mind is directly connected to all Blight Plague biomass within its specific instance. It isn't just connected to the creatures, it's also connected to the sludge that is on the ground, gaining more intelligence the more biomass it has access to. It's not like the Flood. How the Flood, they needed I don't remember which one it was, and I don't remember the character. I think it was Captain Keyes, but I could be wrong. How the Proto Gravemind, it had an actual captain of a starship, like, still alive, and it was basically feeding off of his intelligence and what he knew. Blight Plague doesn't require that. In fact, it doesn't mess with the mind whatsoever. When something is infected, although its body is ripped apart in the most horrendous way possible, in the most agonizing way possible, the mind is still intact. Which means that your mind, your memories, your thoughts are still inside of this creature that was once you, but you have no control over it whatsoever. So it's not uncommon when at later stages, swarms of hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions and tens of millions of plaguelings will march across the battlefield, accompanied with constant wailings of pure terror and agony, as the mind that once controlled that body has gone completely and utterly insane. As you can tell, so far, it sounds horrifying, but oh, just wait, it gets so much worse. So, how does Blight Plague interact with the environment around it? Like I said before, when it comes into contact with plants, it just consumes them, converts them, and it makes more sludge. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't make a plagueling out of a plant. I don't even know how you would do such a thing. The important thing about Blight Plague is that it's not terraforming. It's very similar to the Tyranids, how it will consume every single bit of Blight Plague biome, or any amount of biomass on the planet, whether that come from plants or animals. And once it's consumed all of it, theoretically, it will have gained enough intelligence to understand how to get off-world and go to a new world and infect once more. The thing about Blight Plague, as an outside viewer, is that it's not malicious. It doesn't want to destroy everything. It simply wants to grow and become more powerful and become more intelligent. That's all it wants. As a side effect, it annihilates entire civilizations in the process. So there are multiple different types of Blight Plague entities. We have the most basic, which is plaguelings, which we talked about. These are animals or people that have come into physical contact with Blight Plague biomass, the sludge, and have been converted into the most basic form. Again, they're not particularly dangerous, they're not particularly powerful, they're not particularly agile, and they're not intelligent whatsoever. They're capable of following the orders of the hive mind, but only up to a certain extent. Once the hive mind has consumed enough biomass, it's capable of creating pure forms. And pure forms are the dangerous ones. They are very resilient to almost every single type of damage. They are intelligent, they are incredibly agile, and they are ferociously strong. And they're essentially the main infantry of the Blight Plague. These things will come out in swarms that are billions strong, surging across the surface of the planet just to find something to infect and turn into a plagueling, or gain more biomass so that more pure forms can be created. One important thing is that we need to know when it creates these different types of creatures, which is why we're going to be going over how it consumes a world, and then right after we'll go on to how it invades a secondary world. So it is theorized by the Siritan Empire, who has the most experience fighting Blight Plague, that after consuming 0.5% of the planet's total biomass, and keep in mind, this counts oceans. It can absorb the water in the oceans of the planet and use it as biomass. How? I don't know. As well as everything that exists inside of the ocean, all the fish and all the different creatures. So it's believed that once it consumes 0.5% of total biomass on a planet, and we're talking about a planet as lush and vibrant as Earth is, it is considered to be incredibly difficult, if not nearly impossible, to stop the Blight Plague at this point. 0.5% of the total planet's biomass. Because at this point, it reaches a tipping point. And that is that at this specific point, it's going to have a lot of plaguelings. Think about how much territory of the planet is 0.5%. You might actually have to look that up on Google. I don't know it offhand, but it's a fair chunk of land. And chances are there's going to be a lot of creatures in there, whether they be animals or people, that have become infected. And as a result, it'll spread out in every single direction like wildfire. Once it reaches 5% total biomass is when pure forms start to be created and deployed. And this is considered the point of no return. Once pure forms are being made, they're like I said, they're far more resilient. They're far physically stronger. They're far more agile. They have actual intelligence that can use tactics. This is when things start to get dangerous. And it's essentially at this point either mass deploy like napalm or promethium airstrikes, carpet bomb the area that is infected and create a cordon of literal flame to hold it back, or there's nothing that's going to be able to stop it. Because at this point, pure forms, they're incredibly resilient to, like I said, kinetics, chemical, corrosive, energy-based weapons, explosives. There's nothing that can really stop pure forms. They can be stopped. They can be stopped en masse as well, but they are significantly more tanky and significantly harder to deal with. Once the Blight Plague has consumed a quarter of the planet's total biomass, this is the absolute, there's no hope. This planet is lost. Once a quarter of the planet's biomass is consumed. Because at this point, the hive mind starts to become advanced enough where it starts using, albeit be very simple tactics, but it is starting to create tactics and plans and responding to various different stimuli that are being inflicted upon it by the attacking force, and it's becoming more intelligent, capable of countering certain things. Once we hit 35%, we see our first specialized form, or special infected. This is the tipping point, because if you have enough guns, you have enough fire, you have enough people who are being smart and not getting infected, and you have enough orbital barrages coming in from ships in the void of space in orbit around it, you could quarantine the Blight Plague after it reaches that 25% mark. You're not going to stop it because it's growing so much, but you can very loosely quarantine it long enough to get the population off of the planet. But you're not going to be stopping it at this point. And that 30 or 35%, I forget which one I said, that is the point in which the first special infected comes out. And keep in mind, the special infected are pure forms as well. And the first one is known as the Abomination. And it's literally diseased muscles on top of muscles on top of muscles. It's literally designed as a fortification breaker. It is largely bipedal, however, its form can vary wildly, just like pure forms and plaguelings. There's no set, this is what a human plagueling looks like, this is what a cheetah plagueling looks like. They mutate and change physically in a staggeringly different amount of ways. There's no setup code on how these things are going to look. And as a result, abominations, they don't look like one specific type of infected. They're normally bipedal, like humans, and are incredibly tall, and like I said, just muscles on top of muscles on top of muscles. They're designed to charge at enemy fortifications, such as like citadels and fortresses, and just plow right through the defenses, and just destroy the walls, infiltrate their whatever defensive systems that they have in place, so that the rest of the Blight Plague can flood in through the breach. They are also insanely durable to everything and are damn near immune to fire at this point, which means it's largely only high caliber explosives, sustained fire from weaker damage types, and straight up orbital bombardment that can deal with these things because they are so damn tanky. Once we hit 45% is when we see one of the worst ones. There are 4 special infected in total. At 45%, we see one of the worst ones, which is the Plague Father. And they are grotesque creatures that are quadrupedal, however, largely only move on their forelegs rather than their hind legs. Their hind legs are typically very underdeveloped, which means a good half of their body is endlessly dragging across the terrain, ripping itself open and spewing that sludge all over the place whilst constantly repairing itself of all of the damage that it's doing, dragging itself across the ground. It's also capable of creating pure forms within it and essentially just ripping open its stomach and letting loose hordes of pure forms before once again its stomach knits back together and it starts to create new pure forms. One of the most dangerous things about it is that it can essentially projectile vomit a hyper corrosive variant of the Blight Plague sludge at like insane distances and just coat everything in sludge, either infecting it or the corrosion just destroying fortifications, completely melting tank armor and any power armor soldiers may be using. Even some of the Siritan Empire's mightiest weapons, their war machines, which is what they're actually called, which are essentially equivalent to Warhammer 40k Titans. Plague Fathers are an equal match to those things, and some of those of the larger war machines are even equipped with null void shields, or I guess null shields. Not only that, but these absolutely horrendous abominations. I know there's already the abomination itself, but Plague Fathers stand at around 20 feet tall. They're gigantic. When we hit 65% of total biomass coverage, we have the third special infected form, and this is one that every single faction, whether they be minor or major, if they've lived to tell the tale of seeing these things, they have one response in common: leave it alone. Don't fuck with it. Don't mess with it. Don't try to kill it. Leave it alone. The only thing that you should do is, if you see them and you can risk losing the planet, atomize the planet. Because these things are just horrific. They're known as necrosis. And necrosis, you can actually Google what. Here, let me quickly pull up my phone and I will tell you what the definition of necrosis is. Necrosis definition is: necrosis is a process of cell death in which cells undergo irreversible damage and lose their normal functions. It occurs when cells are exposed to harmful conditions such as trauma, burns, frostbite, various different infections like bacterial, viral, fungal infections, so on and so forth. Basically, it's the death of cells. Only the Blight Plague decided that it was going to go with the idea of necrosis, but also make it a horrifying opposite parody. Technically, the Blight Plague didn't name these things necrosis. I don't think that the Blight Plague actually has a name for all of these things. These names were originally given by the Siritans, and basically every other faction was like, yeah, that makes sense. We're calling them that. Necrosis, not so much. The necrosis comes in a horrifying multitude of different forms. I can't even say that they're primarily quadrupedal or bipedal. They come in every single shape and form that you can possibly imagine. They are almost completely indestructible, being almost immune to every single form of damage. Again, kinetic, acid, corrosion, thermal, explosive, energy. These things are even capable of surviving nuclear strikes and nuclear bombardments, which is quite literally throwing like 20 nukes at the problem and hoping that it sorts itself out. Yeah, these things can survive even something as devastating as that, which would cause a literal nuclear holocaust. Not only that, but the thing that makes them so incredibly dangerous is that a necrosis has 2 miniature versions of itself inside of it. And when it dies, its body ruptures and these two smaller versions come out, and they very rapidly grow to full maturity. And guess what's inside of both of those spawn? Two more smaller necrosis. So every single time you manage to kill one, it's literally a Hydra problem. Kill one and two take its place. If you constantly kill them, you could have legions into hundreds of strong of these things. And they are insanely fast. They're capable of blitzing through almost any fortification. They have the projectile vomit ability of Plague Fathers, as well as capable of undergoing relatively slow, but still capable of undergoing forced evolution depending on what is affecting them. They're insanely dangerous, and typically if one shows up on a planet, it's just like, okay, that planet's a lost cause. Just the equivalent of Warhammer 40k's Exterminatus. Destroy the planet. I don't want to even think that this thing ever existed. The final special infected comes at around 90% of the total planet's biomass, and this is a response to ensure that any minor pockets of resistance are completely crushed. And it's around this time that the Blight Plague instance starts creating infected forms that serve as ships, kind of like the bioships of the Tyranids sort of thing, as well as even, if possible, commandeering Void Ship themselves and infecting them. The final version is known as the Mutator, and we just got done with apologies, random yawn. We just got done saying how horrifying the necrosis is. The Mutator is on a whole different level. So if you remember how I just said that it's very slow, but necrosis are capable of undergoing forced evolution to deal with some of the stimulants that is being inflicted upon it by enemy forces. The Blight Plague essentially took that specific concept and took it to its absolute extreme. Mutators have no form. They're essentially just amorphous balls of sludge that manage to maintain cohesion. Every single thing that you throw at it, it undergoes within fractions of a second immediate forced evolution, meaning they could be just a ball of sludge that's rolling across the ground, and like you shoot a pistol at it, and all of a sudden, within a fraction of a second, a tentacle the length of a football field covered in spikes could just come out and whip you right in half. And now it just has a tentacle waving around as it moves forward. And it doesn't matter what you throw at it. Like, it requires mega carrier class fire on it in order to deal with these things. Like, it requires spinal weapons from mega carriers, which typically destroy planets. So that kind of gives you an idea of how difficult it is to take on mutators. Taking it on from extreme range with ballistic missiles, it will force evolve itself within a fraction of a second in some way, shape, or form that is a perfect counter to those ballistic missiles, swarming it in just with a fuckload of dudes with even Solstite rifles. It will create energy and thermal resistant armor all over its body in the form of a carapace, and then just unleash those kinds of tentacles. Like, any possible thing that you can throw at this thing that doesn't immediately annihilate it, it will evolve instantly to counter it perfectly. Now, we haven't been talking about the overall capabilities of the hive mind's of the Blight Plague hive mind intelligence. When it reaches around 55%, it's capable of using very advanced tactics. We're talking military level tactics. It's becoming incredibly intelligent, and it's understanding, actually literally understanding the weapons and tactics that its enemies are using against it. And it can change itself on demand, and even its essentially the extensions of its bodies, its creatures on demand to suit that specific need. It's basically like the Tyranids, only infection rather than just hordes of bugs running around. It's horrifying. And the fall of a world going from 0% infected to 100% infected, these battles can last hours. It can take over a planet the size of Earth in maybe 12, 14 hours. That fast. The entire planet completely consumed and infected. Once it reaches that 90% mark, when it starts creating the mutators, is when it starts to have enough intelligence to create infected bioforms that can survive the void of space. And basically, it just crams all the Blight Plague material into that ship and pisses off into the void of space. And once enough of these ships have been created by consuming enough planets worth of biomass, it is officially recognized as a plague fleet. So, how does the Blight Plague invade a world? There are a lot of similarities with how the Tyranids invade, as well as, this is a bit of an interesting one, the Zerg from StarCraft, how they invade. The Blight Plague is solely reliant on the sludge. That's all that matters. These creatures, they don't need to maintain a physical form, which means a lot of times when it invades a planet, it drops essentially massive, almost like the StarCraft Zerg spores. Massive sacks that are just filled with sludge. Hyper-pressurized sludge. And when it impacts the ground, it erupts like a geyser in every single direction, coating massive swaths of land with the Blight Plague sludge. And then once that sludge is on the ground, so long as there's enough on the ground to constantly be pushing outwards in every single direction, the hive mind will start to turn some of this sludge into pure forms and special infected if it can, if there's enough biomass on the ground. And then those pure forms will go to create more plaguelings and so on and so forth. And so when it's consumed a planet, it's essentially runs off of the philosophy of the Zerg and the Tyranids. Basically, they go into massive pools, are converted just into the purest form of the biomass, and then basically slurped up through a straw into the ships, and then they just kind of go along their merry way. I guess the Zerg don't really do that, do they? They kind of just leave them there under the guidance of a what the hell are they called? Horde Queen or what are they called? It doesn't matter. We're not here for StarCraft. But anyway, it's very much like the Tyranids, how they just literally throw themselves into digestive pools and they get slurped up through giant fleshy straws right back up into the ship. And so basically the Blight Plague will choose a location that isn't heavily fortified, can't really be intercepted by heavy anti-air, and is largely out of the range of any sort of artillery. Like some desert in the random ass crack of the planet that nobody ever goes to. And it'll basically quite literally just unleash a few of these hyper-pressurized pods down to the planet. If the majority of them make it, fantastic. It starts quite literally, it's like a deluge. It's like a monsoon. There is so many pods, because again, the Blight Plague doesn't have to worry about making sure that a pure form goes from orbital drop onto the planet, safely maintaining its physical form. It's not like a human. If we tried to do that, we would have specific procedures and countermeasures to ensure that if we ODST'd ourselves towards a planet, we would survive the landing. But there's no creatures for the Blight Plague to have to worry about ensuring that they survive. Maybe special infected, and maybe even the higher class, infected bio-titans. But just for initial invasion, it's literally just a fucking monsoon, a deluge of these drop pods dropped in the hundreds of millions per second, launched at the planet, and it just basically, so many are hitting the ground so fast that it literally just makes a mountain out of this sludge that slowly pulls back downwards like water. Well, not quite like water, more like molasses, but you get the idea. And from that massive mountain, quote unquote, of sludge, it starts creating the pure forms. And if there's enough there, it starts to make special infected. And if there really is a lot there, it might make a bio-titan or two. Think of Blight Plague Bio-Titans, because there's not really a specific one. The Syrtan Empire has never categorized one as a specific one. They just generally call them Bio-Titans. You can basically think of them like the Tyranids Hydrophants. These massive fuck-off creatures that stand as tall as fucking Warhammer 40k Titans. We're talking like Warlord Titans. Because Hierophants are fucking massive. They really are. They're like the size of Reaver or Warlord Titans, I think. I could be wrong. I don't know a lot of Tyranid lore. But anyway. So basically it just launches absolutely ridiculous amounts of these pods at the planet and just focuses on one localized area. Now this may sound like it'd be incredibly stupid, because if there is literally, it basically looks like a solid pillar of Blight Plague biomass falling from the sky, that's a pretty good indication that, hey, we should start blitzing or nuking the fuck out of that spot. But the Blight Plague specifically chooses areas that have the lowest possible chance of this occurring, largely because they're in desolate areas that there isn't a person around for hundreds of thousands of miles, or maybe tens of thousands of miles. I might be a little overboard for 100, but you know, it's not something that a planet's defense forces are capable of rapidly dealing with. Go home. I apologize for that, just randomly muting, but the dumbass thing apparently decided that I had said something very specific, and it hasn't worked for ages. I need to unplug it and plug it back in, but I've never gotten around to doing it. Anyway, so they can't really get to it rapidly. They could send in rapid response crafts and drop napalm in it, but that's essentially like throwing a match in a bucket of water and expecting all the water to evaporate instantly. It's not gonna happen. You're basically just doing a futile effort. It's completely futile. And so Blight Plague will do one of two tactics typically. If these two tactics don't work, it will employ other more complex tactics such as infiltration and sabotage and stuff like that, which it can do. But it's largely either it's going to bum rush the shit out of the planet's dominant species, whatever their primary fortifications is either going to bum rush the shit out of them like it's World War Z zombies, or it's going to do hit and run tactics and try and goad the enemy into coming out and trying to engage them, and then just basically pincering the ever-living hell out of them and surrounding them from every direction, and then just infecting them all. And as a result, planets can fall very quickly. Now, how do you stand against a Blight Plague invasion? Well, first, you need a strong enough fleet to prevent those ships from even getting anywhere near the planet. Because if they start dropping those pods, even if a couple of hundred manage to get through, it's almost game over at that point. Because the hive mind is so advanced, it doesn't have to slowly build up to the point of being at that 25% infected to get those pure forms. It can just make the pure forms right off the bat, because the hive mind has the biomass of at least one planet. So you would need to destroy every single ship in order to weaken it, because that's how it works. If it suffers a catastrophic loss of Blight Plague biomass, it will actually become stupider. It doesn't retain its intelligence just because it learned that intelligence. Which means that if you know what you're doing and you can effectively deal with all of the Blight Plague in a specific instance, you technically can contain it and study it, even though it's an active hive mind that wants nothing more than to kill you because you literally stuck it in a cage. You are capable of doing that. It's dangerous and difficult because just the minorest of wrong moves, and you have an epidemic on your hands that might destroy your entire planet. So, as a result, you need a fleet, a defense fleet that is strong enough to deal with these ships. Now, the Blight Plague is wise, despite it being a, again, I don't want to say a disease, but that's kind of what it is. It's incredibly intelligent and wise, which is why a lot of times 90% of the infected ships that it has access to are mounted with its own version of a spinal weapon, and it basically fires a spike the size of the Statue of Liberty, and it's hyper reinforced on the outside to be able to pierce through the thickest of corrodium armor on the hulls of ships and punch into the hull of the ship. And basically, when that happens, the tip of this spike becomes annihilated, and on the inside of the spike is hyper pressurized Blight Plague sludge that just rockets out in every single direction, filling entire decks in a fraction of a second. And it's basically impossible. If one of these infection spikes hits your ship, that's it. You might as well turn your guns on that ship, because in a few minutes, that ship is no longer going to be yours, because there is not a damn thing shipboard security is going to be able to do to stop this thing, as it just rips through the ship and then floods it with sludge and pure forms that are coming from that sludge. So as a result, the planetary defense fleet has to be at extraordinarily extreme range. And as a result, the majority of them, their weapons' optimal ranges are far closer than the optimal range of engaging an infection ship. And as a result, there's not really anything a fleet can do. It requires hyper-specialized fleets that are designed to deal with plague fleets that have extreme range weapons, lance batteries, missiles, spinal weapons, torpedoes, anything that can go at extreme range. We're talking the distance from Earth to Mars. That's how far away they need to be. Just insane amounts of distance. Otherwise, their ship, they run an incredibly high risk of it becoming infected and turning its guns upon its own fleet. Now, what happens in the worst case scenario? Let's say the defense fleet managed to destroy the bioships in orbit, and it loses a couple hundred, maybe even 1,000 of these pods, and now that's all the hive mind has access to. It should still theoretically be enough to create pure forms, although probably won't have enough for special forms. At that point, it's quite literally stand your ground, because yeah, you could go out there and you could start blitzing it, but your forces are going to get overwhelmed. But of course, if you just sit there, the Blight Plague is just going to slowly start consuming the rest of the planet that is outside of your walls. So there's really nothing you can do unless you have like a hangar of hundreds of thousands of interceptors that are all equipped with promethium and napalm carpet bombs. There's nothing you can do. It's hold your ground and hope to God a defense fleet arrives that has sufficient lance arrays and lance batteries that can scorch the surface of the planet and burn all of that Blight Plague biomass away. Because anything else, you're not going to survive. You're not going to have enough. So, in the last episode, we had talked about the HMSSA Dawn's Light. And we had specifically said that its purpose was to suppress, not destroy, but suppress Plague Fleet Leviathan. So, what is Plague Fleet Leviathan, and what are Plague Fleets in general? Well, Plague Fleets is quite literally a fleet of Blight Plague bioships. And when there's enough of them, we're talking like a couple hundred of them, they're officially recognized as a Plague Fleet. Now, typically, Plague Fleets are given a numerical value, and they're tracked very carefully to ensure that the Saracen Empire and any other faction it may be coming across is very, very well aware of its current whereabouts. That way they don't get surprised, ambushed. However, certain ones that have really made themselves distinct and unique are given a unique moniker, such as Plague Fleet Naga, which, for whatever reason, the Blight Plague hive mind of that Plague Fleet decided that snake-like infected was the best choice, and generally it works. Plague Fleet Leviathan is not only notorious for creating Leviathan and Biotitan class infected in unusually high amounts for any Blight Plague instance, but it is also quite literally Leviathan sized. Like, there was which Saracen Empire was it? I think the 28th or 29th Saracen Empire. They literally had an entire universe cordoned off and quarantined simply because Plague Fleet Leviathan was in it. And they deployed Dawn's Light. They destroyed a truly insane amount of the Holy Armada. We're talking 2/5 of the entire fleet, of the entire armada. And keep in mind that the entire armada cannot exist wholly bow to stern, starboard to port side within a single universe. It requires multiple universes to hold them all in that kind of formation. That's how big the Holy Armada was. And they sent in 2/5 of the entire armada with Dawn's Light to try and deal with Leviathan, and it broke containment. It forced its way out of the quarantine. And the only reason that the Saracen Empire managed to hold it inside of that quarantine for so long is solely because Plague Fleet Leviathan wanted to stay there. It wasn't being forced back. It wasn't being pushed into a corner. It was just chilling there like, yeah, I kind of want to vibe here for a little while. I'll go back to obliterating entire universes in one go at a later time. I want to sit back, relax, and enjoy the view for a second. Just look at these completely barren rocks that once used to be planets. Aren't those just beautiful? Okay, it's time for me to leave and just fucking blitz, just straight through the cordon. Like it wasn't even there. It was like a hot knife through butter. The Saracen Empire stood no damn chance. They even put Dawn's Light in front of it, directly in front of the Plague Fleet. And they basically just went around it because whatever technology Dawn's Light has, the Blight Plague is quite literally incapable of infecting it. It has something to do with unique null shields that Dawn's Light has. Either Plague Fleets or Blight Plague in general simply can't see it because of the frequency of the shields, or they simply just can't penetrate through it. Keep in mind, infection ships, despite the fact that a null shield quite literally blinks it out of reality as if it never existed, even like a frigate-sized infection ship, the spike that they fire can blow through null shields, which means they theoretically can take down mega carriers if they really want to. Now, whether or not an infection ship is actually going to get within range of a mega carrier is basically non-existent, but if a Plague Fleet really wanted a mega carrier, which they have tried a few times, they can absolutely annihilate the shields of a mega carrier. In fact, the Saracen Empire almost lost a mega carrier once. It was one of the HMS's war stocks that they almost lost. Yeah, you remember the ship that is literally guns upon guns upon guns with almost no defenses whatsoever? Yeah, an infection spike came within like a couple 100 miles of the hull, And that was only because of evasive maneuvers were undertaken at the onset of the spike being fired. Which sounds like a long distance, but in Void Warfare, that's essentially point-blank range. You cannot get closer and miss. So, the Blight Plague has certainly been determined at times, but for whatever reason, they completely ignore, they don't attempt to even fire these spikes at Dawn's Light. They just avoid it at all costs, and they basically go around it like water. You know, like Dawn's Light is an island and the water just goes around the island. It doesn't try to go over the island, it just goes around it. It just completely ignores the island altogether. Or in this case, completely ignores Dawn's Light. Now, the Seraton Empire's response, generally, to Blight Plague depends on the current level of biomass it has access to. If it's the first spawning event where it just blinks into reality, fucking napalm strike it. Deal with it as quick as possible. Don't give it time for any animals to get near it. Just fucking scorch earth it. If they have a planet's worth of biomass, send in one of the fleets that are specifically designed to engage Blight Plague ships and bioships. And just try to take them out at long range. If they become a recognized plague fleet, you'll need a dedicated fleet to deal with said plague fleet. If they become a named plague fleet like Naga or Leviathan, at that point, the Seraton Empire sends a fraction of the Holy Armada itself. And if there was ever a plague fleet to come on the same level as Leviathan, they would deploy Dawn's Light within a fraction of a second and guarantee that that thing gets annihilated before it becomes as powerful as Leviathan at its pinnacle. The rest of the factions largely defer to the Seraton Empire. No matter how bad the blood is between each of the factions, like, there have been instances where the Seratons and humans are literally in the middle of a war that is spanning, like, a galaxy, and a Blight Plague will all of a sudden just pop up, like a random named plague fleet, and they'll just have a complete ceasefire and allegiance until the plague fleet is dealt with, because they both understand just how dangerous this is. And as a result, it's one of the only instances where in that specific situation, the human forces will literally give full command authority to the Seraton commanders, or whoever's in charge, despite the fact that they were literally just seconds ago at total war with them, trying to kill each other. That's how dangerous these things are. Doesn't matter what faction. Florian, Yvetan, Bastilian, Human. The only ones that don't do this is the Barramon, and that's because the Barramon are literally, like, Halo brutes and Warhammer 40k orcs in one nutshell. They're just aggressive beyond any reason, and so typically they'll just try to bum rush, and it's definitely gotten the Barramon their ass handed to them a lot. But you can see why this threat is so insanely massive. They can infect ships in orbit, so you can't deal with them that way. You know, that's one of the benefits of, like, fighting the Nids. If you can find one of their hive fleets, it's going to take a massive fucking fleet, but you can deal with a hive fleet. You know, it's easier than trying to get the Nids off of a planet. Somewhat. I mean, it's still the Nids. They're still a huge, huge fucking problem. But it also depends on whether or not the hive fleet is active or dormant. If they're dormant, you have an advantage. If they're active, I don't know about that. But, you know, facing the Blight Plague on a fleet, unless you can outrange it, you're fucked. You know, same with the Nids. If they're on the planet, if Blight Plague is on the planet, you're fucked. There's not a damn thing you can do to stop it. And it literally just... It's the hyper aggression and difficulty of dealing with Nids, and just the absolute literal numbers of orcs. Like, if your planet gets hit in 40k with a serious WOG, like, there are instances where in stories and stuff, they literally say that a aristocrat is on like the top of a hive city, which like the top spires are damn near in space. That's how tall hive cities are. And they just look down at the planet below and they can't see individual figures, but like horizon to horizon is just green, writhing mass of orcs just coming in every single direction. It's the same thing with Blight Plague. It's just so unstoppable once it gets its foothold on a planet. So, once again, like with every single faction, there is more information, but we're largely going to keep that for different situations in which it's more understandable to talk about that kind of stuff. You know, these primary faction deep dives, these are a general overview to how dangerous they are, and the more specific or more specific situations we'll cover as we get to them. You know, like, there's obviously a lot more to the Siritan Empire than what the episode was. I think just me talking about the Siritan Empire proper was like over 40 minutes or something like that. Maybe not quite that much. You know, there's a lot more to the Siritan Empire. There is a lot more to the Siritan Navy. There is a lot more to the Blight Plague, but we'll cover that kind of stuff when we get to it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you guys are looking forward to more. I don't know what we're going to do next Tuesday for our deep dive. I'm thinking we'll probably go over another major faction, but I've had a nonstop desire to talk about one of the calamities in depth, one of the Siritan calamities, so we might end up doing one of the Siritan calamities. We're probably not going to do the big head honcho himself, Duran, but we might talk about one of them, either that or we're going to go over one of the primary factions. We'll see. We'll see what I decide and feel like talking about. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you guys are looking forward to tomorrow's episode, our 7 Days to Die episode, as well as Friday's episode, our 7 Days to Die episode, as well as Saturday and Sunday's live streams at noon Central Standard Time, where on Saturday we'll be doing a bit of RimWorld, and Sunday, for the first time in a long time, we're going to be doing our Sunday night live. So, until then, guys, see ya.